Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Ed Haig. You've probably heard from me in various webinars before. Today's session is focused on the evolution of operational improvement consulting, which is taken from part 2 of our strategic planning program for 2014. Our strategic planning program takes a global view of trends in the consulting industry, so it's not specific to any geography. It's looking at trends that affect you wherever you are. Many of you will be familiar with the fact that most of our research involves both clients and consultants. In fact, the bulk of what we're presenting to you today is based on the client side of that divide, if you like. So very heavily influenced by the views of clients, collected through both surveys and interviews, totaling somewhere in the region of 600 or 700 individual connections with clients, whether that's through survey or interview. So a lot of client-based information behind this. In terms of how it fits in with our overall research program, well, many of you will now understand, I think, that our research divides into these 4 major areas: consulting market trends, content strategy, through which we do a lot of thought leadership work, client feedback, and growth strategy. And it's in this last part, the growth strategy quadrant, if you like, that we find our strategic planning program. So we're taking today's session from there, hence the helpful arrow to let you know where you are. That's the subscription part of this part of our research. Then there are outer layers of both custom research and consulting that sit in each of those quadrants, if you like. Just thought that might help to explain where we are for a moment. Here's the picture of the global management consulting market in 2012. We don't have global numbers yet for 2013, although they will almost certainly be similar. I'm expecting growth of somewhere perhaps in the region of 4 or 5%. So in 2012, this was a market worth 96 billion US dollars. We can probably, for the sake of argument, assume that that's looking at, as if it's somewhere around $100 million. In 2013, just for the sake of sort of roundness. But in terms of how that divides up, well, at the bottom of that, and this is by traditional consulting service lines, at the bottom of the pile we have marketing and selling related advice, worth $2.25 billion. A very small service, but one in which we've seen a lot of interest recently, not least because of clients' growing focus on their own growth agenda. So quite a lot of growth here over the last few years, but a small service. Program management, in truth, a little bit of a mixed bag, tends to get used as a bucket by clients, certainly, to put consulting they don't quite know what to do with into it. And an area that's come under quite a lot of pressure as well recently, although at its high end, at the true end of the discipline, if you like, still something that clients very much value. HR and change management is perhaps the last of what we might call the smaller consulting services here, worth $5.68 billion globally. And an area that's really suffered a bit during the downturn. This was, I think, there's a feeling on the part of clients that there's been a lack of innovation here over the last few years, and that as a result they've cut back their spending on HR and change management. Although we're seeing signs of that increasing now, and I think certainly so many projects that clients are undertaking seem to have some sort of a people-related dimension to them now. So it's an area, I think, of great opportunity, and one in which many different types of consulting firms are taking great interest. And then we get on to, if you like, the big consulting services. So strategy worth just short of $14 billion, and I think well-publicized difficulties in that market over the last few years, but nevertheless still a very big part of the consulting market. Financial management and risk. Really a lot of work going on here, largely on the back of regulation, particularly in places like the financial services sector, which is the biggest sector for the global consulting market. So that's worth just short of $20 billion. And then we have technology, which is really understood now to be both the enabler and even the driver of many of the business initiatives that clients are undertaking, whether they be concerned with growth or with efficiency at the moment. I think there's a growing sense that technology has a part to play in just about every kind of consulting project. So not surprising there to see it worth a little short of $23 billion. Worth a little bit more than $23 billion is operational improvement, still sitting top of the pile. And I think a really clear indication that although we have very clearly moved out of the depths of the downturn that we were in a number of years ago, and indeed in many geographies now things are looking really quite positive. Clients keep a very firm interest, a very firm hand and a keen interest on cost and on efficiency. So this is still, by some distance, the biggest consulting service out there. I should say, by the way, that this all refers to what we call the big consulting market. So if these numbers look a little low to you, that's because we're referring to big consulting. Consulting done by firms with more than 50 consultants worldwide and for medium to large size clients. So there's a long tail of consulting that's notoriously difficult to measure and which we're not including in our analysis for the sake of today's session. It varies to a large extent where you are in terms of what proportion of the market is accounted for in this big consulting number. But I think for the sake of very general purposes, we can think about it accounting for about 70–75% of the global market. So that's the picture as it was in 2012. And as I say, I wouldn't expect any service to have overtaken each other, any of the others at the moment, when we produce 2013 numbers. Although of course most will have risen slightly. That's where we were. What are clients planning to do in 2014? Well, we asked them about the major initiatives that they think they'll be undertaking in the next 12 months, and this is what they tell us. So 87% say that they'll be working on initiatives to improve existing technology. And I really think that speaks to the extent to which there's been a scaling back of investment in technology over the last few years. I think there's a very strong sense in the market now that systems are creaking a little bit, that work is needed to bring technology up to speed. And in a sense here, I think this is largely considered not to be discretionary spend. You know, it's sort of imperative that organisations make an investment here because, as I said before, so many of their plans around both growth and efficiency are tied to the availability of technology. But we also see a very large number, 84%, saying that they're going to be taking advantage of new technology in some respect. And I think this is certainly where minds are shifting towards in relation to technology. We hear a lot of clients talking about cloud, about digitization, about social media, about mobility. And many of these are frankly buzzwords, and I think there's a role for consultants in being challengers here rather than simply encouragers, in helping clients to really address what they're doing and why they're doing it. But I think it's fair to say that many clients now look at the new technologies that exist and are starting to think about the potential those have to help them to achieve their aims and in many cases to transform themselves. In organisations, many of them are trying to do quite significant things at the moment, and they're trying to do it in a clever way, a way that doesn't involve increasing their fixed costs substantially. Technology, particularly new technology, is really understood to be a part of that. So no surprise really that both of those technology-related initiatives are thought to be very much in focus over the course of the next year. Regulatory change still drives an awful lot of consulting work, and we have 80% of clients telling us that they will be doing something around a response to regulatory change in the next 12 months. I think a lot of activity remains in the financial services sector. But sectors like energy and resources too, particularly in places like utilities, are heavily regulated and areas in which clients turn a lot to consultants for help. Risk too is an area I think that's very much at the top of many clients' agendas at the moment. So you have 78% of people saying they'll be working on some initiative around risk in the next 12 months. And I think particularly there we do hear a lot about IT-related risks. So cyber security is a very hot topic for many clients at the moment. And then a couple more of a slightly different flavour. So that here's the growth agenda coming through. 85% of clients saying they'll be exploring new opportunities for growth in the course of the next year. And I think it's really telling to see that number sitting alongside the focus which I'm about to talk about in terms of operational improvement and efficiency, because it does rather point to the idea that whilst we are moving towards a market that's focused on growth, clients haven't lost their interest in keeping costs down. Indeed, I spoke to someone just recently and said, how long do you think that the focus will remain on keeping costs down? And he said, I think it'll be forever. I don't think it's ever going to go away. And I think that's probably quite right. I think this is now with us to stay. It's not that we're going to be in either cost-cutting mode or growth mode. I suspect from now on we're likely to be in both at the same time. And there's globalization, a slightly lower number, 73% talking about globalization being a part of their plans in the next 12 months. And I think globalization, a bit like technology in a sense, is understood to be the enabler of many other types of plans. It's certainly the enabler of many clients' growth plans, but it's also the enabler of their operational improvement, of their efficiency plans too. Particularly in Europe, I think there's a real understanding that globalization is what delivers on these kind of aims. I think it's a slightly different situation in the US, where globalization tends to play second fiddle to digitization in terms of the impact it can have for clients on some of the major things that they're looking at. But globalization a very big focus still. But really, frankly, when push comes to shove, the focus still remains very clearly on cost cutting. So 90% of people saying that they're going to be working on some kind of cost cutting initiative in 2014. 93% talking about productivity and or efficiency, and a slightly smaller number talking about simplification, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But I think this really speaks to the idea that though we may be out of the woods economically speaking, there's still a very strong focus here on cost, efficiency and productivity. And it would be a foolish consultant that assumed that had gone away and that clients were now entirely focused on growth. So this is really still where a lot of client attention remains. The focus is though changing. So cost cutting is really where heads have been, and indeed I think it's fair to say that many are still in this mode, particularly in Europe, and particularly in places like Southern Europe and the Benelux region. So I don't think this has gone away by any means, and while people in some parts of the world have moved on a little bit from this fairly simple view of operational improvement, it remains a big feature of the market. We still hear a lot about Lean and Six Sigma, and although those aren't necessarily driving consulting work to the same extent that they once were, cost cutting is still pretty important to a lot of people. But the focus is shifting. It's shifting away from cost cutting towards a more sophisticated view of operational effectiveness, towards productivity. And this is the sort of thing that companies who've now escaped from the crisis are talking about. They're talking about wanting to grow without adding extra cost. It's about a shift here, I think, from a tactical response to macroeconomic problems to a more considered response to long-term trends. And we hear a lot here about not so much cost cutting as cost management, cost optimization, and even the idea of cost as investment. It's a more sophisticated view of cost. Within here too, we're seeing quite a resurgence of interest in outsourcing and shared services, areas that I think came under some fire, quite rightly so perhaps, some time ago. But I think there's a resurgence of interest in things like outsourcing and shared services at the moment. So this is sort of the next iteration of this kind of cost-cutting agenda, the place that clients who have done all their cost-cutting are sort of moving on to. We're keeping a firm hand on this. We're keeping a keen eye on it. But we need a more sophisticated view now. And then I think that finally evolves into ideas of simplification, and this is perhaps the most sophisticated view of operational effectiveness. It's about a recognition that organizations can't be more productive and more efficient unless they make themselves simpler. There's a sense here, I think, that organizations now have become very complex, multi-dimensional, diversified entities, and that a great amount of complexity has come in as a result of that, and that really an organisation's ability to be productive and to be efficient depends on actually simplifying a bit first. This is very much in evidence in some areas more than others. So we hear a lot more about simplification, for example, in places like Germany and the Nordics than we do elsewhere. And that, again, to some extent, that's due to the kind of phase that those countries are in terms of the economic cycle. I think it's much more related to service-related businesses, for example, rather than manufacturing, where simplification has kind of always been part of what manufacturers do. But it's seen by many now, I think, as the key to scalable growth. This is really about how you get growth in future and keep yourself efficient. And I think in many ways it's seen to bridge cost control, growth, and regulation. It sort of answers all the needs of all of those. For many people, I think this is also about mitigating the effects of inorganic growth. I think that many organisations that have grown inorganically over the last years have created this complexity that is now creating problems in and of itself. So simplification, I think, the kind of the final iteration, if you like, of that operational effectiveness paradigm. And there may be things we can't see yet, but it's certainly where client minds appear to be going at the moment. And the role of consultants, I think, is evolving too. So the interesting thing we see here is that where we talk about simple cost cutting, the difference between cost cutting happening and not happening cost cutting doesn't seem to have a huge impact on the extent to which clients buy consulting services more broadly. So this chart here shows the extent to which clients expect their expenditure on consulting, not just around cost cutting, but around in all areas to either increase, decrease, or stay the same over the next 12 months. And what we see is that there's not a particularly significant uplift where cost cutting is happening. It's not. There may be slightly more, very slightly more people saying that they expect an increase of sort of 10%, and very few more saying they expect an increase of more than 50%. Where there's cost cutting happening compared with where there isn't. But in truth, it's negligible. There's really not. You don't get much of an uplift in a client that is in pure cost cutting mode. Not least, of course, because consulting is often seen to be one of the costs to be cut in the first place. Compare that with a client that is simplifying. And simplification seems to result in quite a marked, not massive, but nevertheless quite significant uplift in consulting spend across the board. So where people are simplifying, that's leading to consulting spend in all areas, in areas like strategy, obviously in operational improvement, in HR and change. There is this general uplift. We see more people talking about increasing their spend where simplification is happening than where it's not. I think a real sense then that this is a driver of growth in consulting more broadly than simply around the operational agenda. So opportunities here that there perhaps aren't any longer in the cost-cutting space. I think it's probably fair to say that a few years ago these charts would have looked quite different, not least because I don't think so many minds would have been in simplification mode, but certainly a few years ago where cost-cutting was happening, consultants were being turned to very heavily to help with that. But I think to a large extent now clients feel they have the capability in-house to handle what they're trying to do from a cost-cutting perspective. So they're becoming less likely to turn to consultants, whereas simplification is something I think a bit new and something that is more likely to drive consulting work. And indeed, this is really where we see the growth. So if we look at our projections for cost-cutting over the next 3 years, we expect it to fall. Actually, the market for cost-cutting, for consulting around cost-cutting, to fall by about 2% in the next 3 years. Compare that with productivity and efficiency, a market that we expect to grow by about 5% over the next few years. And although it's a smaller market at the moment, and probably quite considerably smaller actually at the moment, simplification, this is where we expect most growth. This is where clients' minds seem to be heading, and it's where opportunity seems to be heading. So we expect an uplift of about 10% in the simplification market over the course of the next few years. So I think for anyone involved in operational improvement consulting, it's really important to understand this evolution. Not, of course, to turn back on cost cutting, and certainly not on productivity and efficiency, which are going to remain a big focus, but really to understand the nature of simplification, really to start developing clear propositions around this for the future, because we expect quite significant growth there over the next 3 years. That's all we've got time for today. If you do have any questions, we'd be delighted to hear from you. Please get in touch with us either via our website or you can use Sarah Burgess's email address, which we've got there. Sarah's able to answer questions about how you get hold of the report itself. But if you want to pick up on anything that we've been discussing today, then please do get in touch. We'd be delighted to hear from you. Thanks very much for joining us.